Amelia Lewis is a zoologist. She has 2 master degrees in animal behavior and a vivid interest in theoretical biology. So we'll hear some of that in this talk, which is called In Search of a Unified Theory of Sensory Perception, Possible Links Between the Vibrational Theory of Olfaction and the Evolution of Language. So please start sharing your screen or presentation.
There we go. Right, there we go. Thank you very much. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my work today. Yes, the paper is titled In Search of a Unified Theory of Sensory Perception, Possible Links Between the Vibrational Theory of Olfaction and the Evolution of Language. Oh dear. It's not moving my slides. Yeah, I got a bit of a problem with my, oh, there we go. It's done it. So the presentation is a series of testable hypotheses looking at the physiological mechanisms underpinning sensory perception and the possible relationship to vocal communication in animals and possibly language evolution in humans. An idea or concept known as frequency mimicking. And I actually have an anonymous reviewer from the journal Biosemiotics to thank for that terminology. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't have any empirical data to present with the hypotheses, but I do have the theory surrounding it and supporting evidence from the literature. So to start, this is really the phenomenon that underpins the hypotheses. And I'll give a brief overview, and I say a brief overview because cross-modal sensory perception is a really diverse and complex field. But in brief, I'm talking about an interaction between 2 or more sensory modalities during sensory perception. As I say, there's a lot of work, particularly in humans, which I guess is understandable because we can report directly on our subjective sensory experiences. And most of the work tends to focus on what we would, I guess, perceive as the main senses, particularly vision, taste, hearing, and smell. I haven't really found anything in the scientific literature on proprioception, although there's been some really interesting talks at the conference on dance, for example. There's nothing on magnetoreception either that I could find. And whilst magnetoreception is not something humans really think about, it is very important for a lot of animal species. For example, these Canada geese at the bottom, they rely on the Earth's magnetic field to be able to navigate tens of thousands of miles across the globe when there aren't really any other cues, for example, when they're above the ocean. As I say, I haven't come across anything in the scientific literature looking at cross-modal perception with magnetoreception, but there is information on multimodal sensory apparatus. So, for example, in birds, and a lot of the studies are on chickens and robins, I don't know why, but there have been a few studies showing that the birds can actually see the Earth's magnetic field. And to do it, they use the cones that are involved in EM vision. And it's particularly the cones that they use to see the ultraviolet end of the spectrum, so very short wavelengths. There is experimental evidence to demonstrate that cross-modal perception is found across species. So there are, as I've said, there's studies in humans. There are also studies on domestic animals, for example, dogs, horses, and goats are the ones that spring to mind. But there are also studies on wild animals. So, for example, this study on a reptile species, this is a Nile crocodile, and studies on insects, for example, this species on tropical butterflies. These 2 on the wild animals, they're interesting. They're on foraging behavior and gustatory consummatory behavior. And what both of the studies found is that the visual cues had to match the chemical cues before the animals engaged in gustatory behavior, so before they ate anything. There are also studies in humans that show the parameters of intensity in one modality directly affect the perception of the intensity of another. And a really good study is this one by Zellner and Kautz, which looks at colour hue and odour intensity. So they presented participants with colour samples of differing hues, followed by an odour sample, and they found that the intensity of the colour affected the perception of the odour sample. There's also the McGurk effect, which is an interaction between hearing and vision. This affects our interpretation of speech in humans. So if you show human participants an audio-visual clip where they're seeing someone pronounce, for example, the letter V, but what they hear is the letter F, they will actually interpret the auditory perception as being a V, which kind of suggests that the visual channel has quite a heavy influence on the auditory channel. There's also synesthesia, where one sensory modality stimulates another. I'm a colour grapheme synesthete, so this at the bottom is how I perceive the alphabet. And it's not learned, it's not associative learning, it's just a naturally, spontaneously occurring phenomenon. Another interesting phenomenon is affective colour perception. So, for example, we tend to associate certain colours with specific emotions. Love is often associated with red or pinks, as interestingly is anger. There are expressions such as green with envy, feeling blue, and yellow-bellied, which means cowardly or fearful. And while some of these are cultural, a lot of them, for example, love and anger, are cross-cultural. So again, this demonstrates it's not a learned phenomenon, it is a spontaneously occurring phenomenon. So I thought about possible explanations as to what explains all this. And one hypothesis is that all sensory modalities operate as mechanoreception processes, but at differing levels of sensitivity. At the moment, the scientific consensus is, well, we know that hearing and touch, for example, are vibrational. Colour vision, it's not really known. We know about cones, but not what the underlying mechanism is. There's no real consensus. Olfaction, the generally accepted consensus is the lock and key mechanism of olfaction, which is where it's the shape of odour molecules, which is detected on nerves in the olfactory epithelium. And that's what gives specific odours their own unique smell. However, there is an alternative hypothesis. It's slightly controversial. It has its opponents and proponents, but it's called the vibrational theory of olfaction. And this is where odours are detected and perceived via the vibration of the molecular bonds in odour molecules. And the underlying mechanism is that of electron tunneling, where electrons behave as waves as well as particles, and the waveform can actually form on the other side of a barrier. I won't go into too much detail of the quantum physics behind that, but somebody who is working, a biophysicist who is working in that field is Dr. Luca Turin. And he does an absolutely fascinating TED talk where he presents his work. It's called The Science of Scent, and he can give far more information on the underlying mechanisms if anyone's interested. But what really fascinated me about his talk is that he actually plays the odour frequencies, the frequencies of the molecular bonds on a keyboard so you can hear them. And that made me ask the question, is there a possible relevance of this to animal communication and human language? Certainly many species, including some songbirds, for example, the European starling and minor birds, as well as mammalian species, seals, dolphins, and elephants are known to use vocal mimicry, and they can even mimic human speech. There's also evidence of more complex information and grammatical and linguistic elements being present in some animal communications. And an interesting recent study is this one by Favaro et al. It's on African penguins. And they found that the vocalizations of these animals do conform to some linguistic laws. So again, I asked the question, could animals be using vocal communication to mimic electromagnetic, molecular, and acoustic frequencies that they've detected in the environment by reproducing them as vocalizations or frequency mimicking, similar to how Luca Turin is able to reproduce the odor molecule vibrations as sound? And if this is true, it would give rise to more complex referential vocal communications beyond simple vocal expressions of emotion. And just out of interest regarding the cognition of animals, the parrot down on the left, that is Alex the parrot. And I don't know whether anyone's heard of him. He belongs to a researcher in America. And even for an African grey parrot, Alex was very, very advanced. And this is him during a study where he's selecting bricks according to their colour on cue. So the first hypothesis, putting all this together then, is to do with the mimicking of odor molecule frequencies. Birds have a very well-developed olfactory sense, and some songbirds, notably the blue tit and the European starling, actually line their nests with aromatic herbs like lavender. The curious thing about these herbs is that they have antimicrobial properties. So the theory behind this is that birds do this to reduce the parasite load in the nest, making it a healthy environment for the juveniles, and therefore it increases the survival chances of the juveniles. So the first hypothesis then is that songbirds produce the vibrational frequencies of volatile aromatics in their mating vocalizations, or song. The second hypothesis is to do with the frequency mimicking of EM frequencies. For this, I'm going into aposematism and mimicry. So aposematism is where animals display a color signal to show that they're dangerous, that they shouldn't be eaten. So for example, we have the social insects, they're known to sting, the bees and the wasps. This on the bottom is a poison dart frog, and to the right, that's a cinnabar moth caterpillar. So not palatable really to predators. This, however, is a hoverfly. It's not a bee or a wasp, it's only got one pair of wings, it's a dipteran, and it's completely harmless. It doesn't sting, it's not toxic, but it still shows this yellow and black coloration. So what do the yellow and black markings mean? Well, I treated the yellow and black pattern as an object, and then I tried to work out what the sign was. And it's not really clear. I don't know whether it's the colour pattern, the contrast between the colours, just the fact that those two colours are together in combination, or something else entirely. But what we can really be sure of is that the interpretation is that it means caution, be careful, avoid, there's a potential hazard here. This is not the same as this red emergency stop colour that we often see in nature and that we use. This is a yewberry. It contains a substance known as taxine. And I think the fatal dose in humans, adult humans, is only about 50 milligrams. So if a blue tit was to eat one, it's not going to survive. And so that seems to be kind of different from this caution, the yellow and black caution sign. And humans use this sign, it's everywhere in our hazard warnings, biohazard, other hazards, crime scene tape, and these bollards at the bottom, not hazardous in themselves, but you wouldn't want to back your car into them. So I started wondering if this cautionary sign meaning occurred anywhere else in nature. And I came across the nightingale's broadband trill. This is a song element, so you can see it starts where the red arrow is, and it's actually part of this bird's mating vocalizations. So it's not a short range call, which is indicating an imminent aggressive encounter. It's a long range vocalization. It's resonated out into the environment as part of the mating vocalizations. And it has the general meaning, this is my territory, don't come in, don't come any closer. So it seems to have a similar meaning to the yellow and black. And when you look further, going back to the cross-modal aspect of it, the great thing I find about spectrograms is that you can actually use them to see sound. And when you do that and you compare it to the yellow and black marking, it led me to ask the question as to whether the origins of the trill were cross-modal frequency mimicking of the yellow and black pattern, which means caution, so a referential descriptive vocalization. And certainly nightingales are not the only animals to use trills. This is a wren, for example, they trill. And also growling in mammals is another broadband frequency. This spectrogram at the bottom here, it looks like a solid block, but actually if you stretch it out, it would look very much like a broadband trill. So the next hypothesis is that trills and growls are descriptors of the yellow and black cautionary pattern. So moving on from there, this is the third hypothesis, and this is to do with acoustic vocal mimicry. And to describe this, I'm going to use a very specific example, and that's starlings. Starlings form breeding pairs and they show biparental pair, and they're renowned mimics. There are a lot of studies on starling mimicry, and there's no real consensus as to why they do it. There are various hypotheses, for example, that it's a social behaviour, but nobody really knows. And just a bit of an anecdotal story. I have a friend who had a pair of starlings nesting in her garage, which happened to be joined onto her kitchen. And she had a dishwasher that played a tune when it had finished its program. And the starlings in her garage actually learned to mimic, they started mimicking the noise of the dishwasher. And so putting all this together, the next hypothesis is that acoustic mimicry actually allows referential vocalizations which describe sounds in the local environment, and that these might act as guides back to the breeding nest, so that while one parent is out foraging, the other one can guide it back whilst reducing predation risk, because obviously a predator, it might respond to birdsong, but it won't respond to the sound of a dishwasher, for example. So just to summarize then, in an overview of all this, the overarching research question is, could frequency mimicking be a basis for vocal communication and indeed the evolution of human language, as opposed to gestural origins or other alternative hypotheses? And the two main overarching hypotheses are that complex language developed from early hominid species and other ancestral animal species, mimicking frequencies that they've detected in the environment to communicate with other individuals. And that secondly, the underlying mechanism is based on a single mechanoreceptor process for sensory perception. And as I say, unfortunately, I don't have any data to present yet, but there are options for experimental studies. For example, there's a lot of data coming through, archaeological and forensic data from early hominids, suggesting that their communicative abilities were a lot more complex than originally thought. And this picture is taken from the Museum of Wales. They summarise some of the research going on. And they also have produced a soundscape that Neanderthal would have heard. But unfortunately, Neanderthal and other early hominids are no longer around, so we can't test them directly, but modern humans are. So not only is there the potential for laboratory-based studies, but we can study visual arts, literature, musicality and emotional expression, and there is the possibility for comparative studies with our close relatives, the great apes. But we can move on to experimental studies with non-human animals as well. There are some really great opportunities out there. The songbirds obviously produce these complex vocalizations, birdsong. The little birds with the orange bill there in the left, they're zebra finches, they're often used in laboratory studies. We've got the cetaceans, the whales and the dolphins. They also produce song, very complex song. There are seals in the top corner, they're known to be vocal mimics as well. And of course, our own relatives, the great apes. So hopefully, well, if anybody's interested in reading any more, these are the papers, In Search of a Unified Theory of Sensory Perception. That was published in Biosemiotics. And I also went on to discuss and develop the idea a bit further in this paper, chemiosemiosis and complex pattern signals, a chemiosemiotic hypothesis of language evolution, and that was published in Linguistic Frontiers. So I'm hoping one day that I might have some evidence, I might be able to find out if songbirds are quite literally singing a rainbow. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, any questions or comments?
Hi, Amelia. First of all, thank you for this fascinating talk. I think it's always challenging to have a talk in the evening, and you managed the challenge. I have a question out of curiosity. When you could you go back to the slide where you show the quotient sign, all of which are yellow and black? I was wondering whether you have looked into the cultural implications. Are, for example, those signs in Japan of the same color? Or I was wondering whether those, whether you have looked into the cultural implications.
Yes, there are studies. I'm not an expert on the human cultural aspect really, but I did look into that when I wrote this paper. And as I say, this yellow and black seems to be relatively ubiquitous, and certainly with the effective colour associations, they are found to be cross-cultural. So yes, I think it needs separating out. There are elements where it's associative or whether it's a cultural origin. but there are definitely some spontaneous, just innate colour associations there. But this yellow and black seems to be one that is relatively ubiquitous. I'm afraid I can't. I'm not an expert on the human cultural aspect, but from what I could find out and from what I read, the yellow and black does seem to be cross-cultural.
Thank you.
Please raise your hands again, those who have questions. I have one for now then, in the meantime. Could you explain in simple terms how the frequencies in a bird song can mimic yellow and a pattern involving yellow and black? I mean, I see the stripes, right? When you indicate the frequencies in the bird song, but how do you see yellow in that, for instance?
This is what I'd really like to test, because the honest answer is I don't know. It was just the meaning seems to be the same of that trill and the yellow and black pattern. And when you compare them visually, they do look strikingly similar. So you get this alternating stripe. It looks like a stripe, and sort of acoustically, it sounds like this alternating, very fast oscillating frequency. So that's what I'd like to test, really. It is purely perceptual. And I don't know, because I don't know what part of that yellow and black is actually the sign, it's really difficult to answer that at the moment. I don't know whether it's the stripy pattern or whether it's some kind of contrast between the frequency that would be yellow light and, well, I guess black, what would be no light, no frequency. And so I don't know whether, you know, if they can hear that and then try and reproduce it as we would try and describe something like onomatopoeically. I don't know whether they would be able to reproduce that as kind of an alternating sequence, a way of describing a series of stripes.
Right, so it seems like the stripes or the pattern is the similarity rather than the exact color, maybe. So
yeah, I think so. I mean, look, when you look at the patterns, they are all slightly different, but they are all this alternating yellow and black. Even when you look at the frog, it kind of has these bars, these stripes, and on the wasp, yeah, it's kind of got a triangular element and the dots, but it does, from a human point of view, human perception, when you look at them, it is the alternating yellow and black, but that's a very human perception. That's why it'd be really interesting to test it, because of course there's no way of knowing whether animals perceive it the same. But certainly I perceive that, and we talk of social insects as being yellow and black stripy. It's kind of when you think of a social insect, that's what you think, the stripy aspect.
Right, now Frederick has a question.
Yeah, that's more like a commentary. I recall in the early days, like 30 years ago, when I was on my way into semiotics, one of the very first papers I heard was by Thomas Seabiok. And he had been commissioned by the American authorities to investigate whether it was possible to make warning signs for nuclear waste that may be read by future human beings in a million years. And he answered, no, that was not possible. Now you say it's possible.
So do I think it's possible?
Yeah.
I didn't quite catch the question, sorry.
Yeah, you know, Seabiok claimed that it was impossible to make warning signs for nuclear waste addressing human beings in a remote future. He said that could not be done. Now you say it can be done.
I did hear that he had thought that would be impossible. I don't know, because I suppose it's true that those signs weren't particularly around during the Victorian era, certainly in this country even. But then we didn't have, in the Victorian era, probably nobody would really have, I don't know, come across the poison dart. I don't know. that's why I'd like to test it, because even if you get data that doesn't support it, you can find out more about what that pattern means to animals. And certainly the fact that we've got Batesian mimics, it seems to have kind of almost decoupled. The yellow and black has become completely decoupled from its true meaning, because the hoverfly isn't dangerous at all. So it's become completely decoupled. It's just why that's happened, and whether animals have that capability to describe, because I suppose as well our language develops all the time. So I guess for animals it could be the same. We sort of assume that, oh well, a dog barks or whines or growls, and that's never going to change, but or unless they sort of go through an evolutionary process that changes in some way the vocal apparatus. But we kind of don't think of animal communications as being plastic, but I don't know. That's why I'd like to test it. It's a starting point.
There's one question or comment in the chat online. Jamila asks whether some of the patterns involving stripes and so on also involves tigers and zebras. I don't know whether you want to elaborate, Jamila. Otherwise, it's up for you to comment, Amelia.
Yes, and I know one of the theories behind those is they are cryptic, so they're involved in camouflage. And this is another thing that I'd really have to work on separating out, is the cryptic stripes. But the interesting thing about the cryptic stripes on, say, a zebra or a tiger is that they're not these straight bars. I mean, as I say, even in the little poison dart frog down there, they're kind of squiggly, but you still get these very straight these stripes. And the same with the wasp. It's got the kind of triangular pattern on it as well, but it's still striped, it's still regular. They're kind of running parallel. Whereas the stripes on the tiger and zebra, they're not. They're a lot more fluid. They're not a regular stripy pattern. So that was actually another reason why I thought that this actual sign itself was the stripy pattern, the alternating yellow and black stripes. But that is an interesting point, and it's how animals, their vision works and they perceive it. Because a slightly tricky thing with testing this is that all animals have different visual capabilities. So for example, a dog doesn't see the color red. They don't have the full range of color vision that we do. So you'd have to look at aspects like that, the relationship that animal has to a sign in its environment, and how it's able to perceive those signs. So it's quite complex, which is probably why I'd start with the songbirds and maybe limit it down to one taxonomic group and the signs that it regularly perceives in its environment, because I'm guessing, for example, a blue tit has never come across a zebra or a tiger. So, but it does come across the social insect species quite regularly. So it's a complex one to plan, and I think you'd have to really narrow it down and do it each study one species by one species, and then maybe do a comparative study.
Right. Is there one last question or comment? Aline?
Thank you very much. I might be saying something that you probably already know, and I'm just being redundant. You know that Peirce had an intuition of the sorts. At some point, he was very critical. He just mentioned it in passing, but to make a bigger point, he was very critical about the, let's call it, psychopedagogy at this time, in that he gave the example where some teachers, would laugh at the notion that a person blind from birth would say that the blare of a trumpet looks like the color scarlet, and he goes against the notion, saying that he wouldn't be surprised if actually there's even a similarity in the oscillation of sound with or in the pair of a trumpet to this color scarlet. I don't remember exactly where this is. It might be in the syllabus. It's not really a question, just a comment in whether you came across this and whether you find it insightful to go in versus scattered opinions on cross-model similarities.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, in fact, the sound's not great. I'm finding it a little bit difficult to hear the sound on my computer. So sorry about that, but maybe the chat might be better. I can have a look in the chat afterwards.
Yeah, we'll do that.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation.